The Gate at Dusk. The orange trees had been Tomas Aguirre's calendar for 43 years. He did not own a watch. Or rather, he owned one, a silver Longines that Rosa had given him on their 20th anniversary. But he kept it in the drawer of the bedside table because wearing it made him feel the hours too acutely. Instead, he read time the way his father had taught him, by the color of the light on the leaves, by the sound of the irrigation channels, by the weight of the air in the hour before dusk. He had been doing it so long that the farm told him everything he needed to know, and the watch stayed in the drawer, its crystal face clouding with the years. It was a Wednesday in late October, and the color of the light told him it was 5:30. He was standing at the edge of row 7, always row 7, where the oldest trees grew, the ones his father had planted in 1951 and that now stood nearly 6 meters tall, their trunks gnarled and dark, their fruit heavy and bright in the failing light. He had walked out with his cane at 4 o'clock, the way he always did, to do the inspection that 3 seasonal workers could have done in his place. But Tomas Aguirre did not walk the rows because the farm needed him to. He walked the rows because the farm was the only thing left that still knew him. The cane was one he had made himself 3 winters ago from a branch of the oldest camsan tree on the property, the one that grew crooked near the eastern fence, the one Rosa had always called El Viejo Torcido, the old crooked one, a name she had applied with equal affection to Tomas himself as the decades had bent his spine into its current slight curve. He had stripped the wood and sanded it with 3 grades of paper and rubbed it with linseed oil until it shone amber in sunlight. It was perhaps the most beautiful object he had ever made, which was notable because Tomas Aguirre had never thought of himself as a man who made beautiful things. The farm was 12 hectares, all of it planted with Valencia orange trees, except for a half-hectare kitchen garden near the house and the small fenced area behind the east wall where Rosa had kept her roses. He had 847 trees in total. He had counted them more than once, and the number always came to 847. And in a good year, they produced between 280 and 310 metric tons of fruit, which he sold to a cooperative in the nearest town of Santa Lucia, 14 kilometers down the dirt road. He employed 3 men on a seasonal basis: Gerardo, who had worked the harvest every October for 22 years, Gerardo's younger brother, Fidel, who had joined 11 years ago, and a young man named Beto, who had started last season and showed promise, in that he listened and did not argue. They had gone home 2 weeks ago, after the last truck had left, and they would not return until the pruning began in February. In the interval, the farm was his alone. He had 78 years, 2 bad knees, a heart that his doctor in Santa Lucia had described as managing, and a dog named Canela, who was 12 years old and slept 16 hours a day near the foot of the kitchen stove. He had been a widower for 11 years. He had been a father for 19 years, and a bereaved father for 15. His son Miguel had died in a mining accident at the age of 26 in a copper mine 400 kilometers to the north. The accident had taken 7 men, and the company had sent a letter of condolence on company letterhead and a check for what they called compensación económica, which Tomas had folded into an envelope and placed behind the Longines watch in the bedside drawer, where it had remained unopened for 15 years. Rosa had died 4 years after Miguel, from a cancer that moved quietly through her body for 14 months before announcing itself, and then moved quickly. She was 63. Tomas had sat beside her bed for the last 11 days and had held her hand until the hand went still, and then he had continued sitting there for what the nurse said was nearly 2 hours, though he had no memory of the time passing. After Rosa went, Tomas had closed the door to the rose garden and wound a length of galvanized wire around the gate latch. He had told himself he would open it again when he was ready. He was still not ready. He walked back from row 7 at 10 minutes to 6, his knees protesting the uneven ground in the way they always protested it, the cane taking some of the load. Canella had followed him as far as row 3 before her own knees had persuaded her to turn back, and she was waiting for him at the porch steps with the expression of patient reproach that she had perfected over 12 years of watching him do things that hurt. He was at the gate, the main gate at the front of the property, a wrought iron structure that his father had built and that leaned slightly to the left after 40 years of use, when he saw them. There were 4 of them, a woman and 3 children. The woman was standing very straight. That was the first thing he noticed, and it was the thing that made him stop walking rather than simply calling out a greeting and asking what they needed. She was perhaps 33 or 34 years old, with dark hair pulled back under a cloth that had once been blue and was now a faded sky color. And she was wearing a dress that had been washed many times, and a pair of shoes that had seen roads. She stood with her back entirely straight, despite the fact that she was clearly exhausted. It was in her eyes, which were steady but had the bruised quality of eyes that have not slept properly in several nights, and in the slight lean of her youngest child against her leg, as if the child had given up on his own legs for the moment. Beside her on the ground was a wooden trunk, dark wood with iron clasps, the kind that people used to carry when they meant to carry everything they owned and nothing they did not need. The oldest child was a boy of perhaps 11 or 12, standing slightly in front of his siblings in the way that oldest children stand when they are trying to appear useful. He had his mother's eyes and a look of concentration that seemed permanent, as though he was always calculating something. The middle child was a girl, 9 or 10, with a stub of pencil tucked behind her ear and paint-stained fingers that Tomas noticed because he was a man who noticed hands. The youngest was a boy of 3 or 4 who was indeed leaning against his mother's leg and looking at Tomas with the uncomplicated curiosity that very small children direct at everything equally. A man with a cane, a large dog, a wrought iron gate, without hierarchy. Tomas stopped at the inside of the gate and looked at them, and they looked at him. "Buenas tardes," the woman said. "Buenas," Tomas said. A pause. The small boy had transferred his attention from Tomas to Canella, who was sitting at Tomas's left heel and returning the scrutiny with the slow dignity of a very old dog. "You are Don Tomas Aguirre," the woman said. It was not a question. "I am," Tomas said. "My name is Elena Vidal," she said. "I am from Pozo Hondo. I've been walking for 3 days. Tomas looked at her shoes again. Yes, 3 days sounded right. "And these are your children," he said. "Mateo," she said, touching the boy's shoulder. "Sofia," the girl. "And this one is Diego, though he will only answer to Dieguito." The small boy had crouched down to be at eye level with Canella and was extending one careful finger toward the dog's nose. "Canella won't bite," Tomas said. "I can see that," Elena said. "She looks like someone who has decided not to bother." It was, Tomas thought, a remarkably accurate description of Canella's entire philosophy of life in her old age. He should have asked what she wanted. He had been standing at his own gate for 2 minutes and had not asked what she wanted, which was unusual for him, because Tomas Aguirre was a practical man who had little patience for extended preamble. But something about the way she was standing, upright, steady, neither hopeful nor desperate, just present, had made him slow down in a way he did not quite understand. "What brings you from Pozo Hondo to my gate?" he asked. Elena Vidal looked at him for a moment with those bruised, steady eyes, and then she said the thing she had apparently been composing in her head for 3 days of walking. "Señor Tomas," she said, "you have an empty home, and we have nowhere to go. Maybe we need each other." The words fell into the late afternoon the way stones fall into still water, simply, without drama, and with a disturbance that spread out in rings after the sound was gone. Tomas Aguirre had been alive for 78 years. In that time, people had asked him for many things at his gate: directions, water, work during the harvest, the occasional loan that was never repaid. No one had ever said to him quite what Elena Vidal had just said. No one had ever framed it that way. Not as a request, not as a plea, but as an observation. An arithmetic observation almost. Here is what you have. Here is what we lack. Here is what we have. Here is what you lack. Perhaps we can solve the equation together. He did not say yes. He also did not say no. Come in, he said. I was about to make soup. You can tell me about Pozo Hondo, and I will listen, and after that we will see. He worked the latch and pushed the gate open. It creaked, as it always creaked, with a sound like a question, and Elena Vidal walked through with her children, the girl, Sophia, pulling the wooden trunk by one of its iron handles because it was too heavy to lift fully. The boy, Matteo, took the other handle without being asked, and together they dragged it across the threshold. Dieguito had not moved. He was still crouched in front of Canella, and now Canella had deigned to sniff his extended finger, which the child received with an expression of pure, solemn delight. Dieguito, his mother said. She smells like orange peel, the boy said to no one in particular. Canella did, in fact, smell like orange peel. She had always smelled like orange peel. No one had ever remarked upon it before. Tomas found himself improbably on the verge of smiling. He suppressed it, because he was not yet ready to be the kind of man who smiled at gates and led them up the path to the house. The kitchen was the largest room in the house, which was appropriate because the house had been built by people for whom the kitchen was the center of the world. It had a ceiling of bare wood beams, a stove that burned wood and gas interchangeably, a table of heavy pine that could seat 8 people and currently served as a desk, a sorting table, a document repository, and only incidentally a place to eat. There were 4 chairs around it, which was how many chairs there had been since Rosa had bought them at a market in Santa Lucia 30 years ago, and there were hooks on the wall with hanging garlic and dried chili and a clay pot that had belonged to Tomas's mother and that he would not use but could not bring himself to put away. He made soup. It was the soup he made every evening, a simple caldo of whatever vegetables the kitchen garden had given him that week, this week being potatoes and chard and a handful of dried chickpeas he'd soaked since morning, with a ham hock for depth of flavor. He had always made it for one, which meant a moderate-sized pot, but tonight he added more water and more potatoes and cut the chard finer so it would stretch further. And he did all of this without announcing it or making a ceremony of it. Elena sat at the table and did not offer to help, which he respected. She had understood without being told that this was his kitchen and she was a guest in it, not yet anything more. But she watched him work with the quiet attention of someone cataloging information, where the knives were kept, how the stove was lit, the way he moved around the room with his cane hooked on the edge of the counter when both hands were needed. Matteo sat across from her and had produced from some pocket a small, worn notebook that he opened without explanation and began to study. Sophia had taken the pencil from behind her ear and was drawing something on the blank side of a folded piece of paper she'd retrieved from her dress pocket. She drew with the speed and certainty of someone for whom drawing was not an activity, but a reflex, the way other people drummed their fingers or talked to themselves. Dieguito had fallen asleep in his chair before the soup was on the table, his head tipped sideways at an angle that should have been uncomfortable but apparently was not, his small face slack and entirely trusting in the way of children who have not yet learned to sleep guardedly. Tomas served the soup, and they ate. He found he was not hungry. He rarely was in the evenings. But he ate because eating at a table with people required eating, and this was a rule he remembered from before the years of eating alone. "Tell me about your husband," he said, because it was the thing that needed to be said first, and he had never seen much point in arriving at the necessary thing by a long route. Elena set down her spoon. She had not flinched. She had, Tomas thought, already done her flinching in private in the 3 days of walking. "His name was Hector," she said. "He worked the cornfields for Don Arsenio Prada in Pozo Hondo. He got dengue in February. He was sick for 12 days. On the 13th day, he was gone. She picked up her spoon again. He was 37 years old. I am sorry, Tomas said. Yes, Elena said, in the tone of someone who has heard the words many times and accepted them without being particularly comforted by them. And the house in Pozo Hondo? It was Don Arsenio's house, tied to the job. When Hector died, Don Arsenio he was not unkind. He gave us until September. But September came. She looked at the table for a moment. My mother's family is in the north, near the border, and I could not get there with 3 children and no money for the bus. A woman in Pozo Hondo, Doña Clemencia, she told me about you, that you are alone here, that your farm is big, that you are a man who kept his word when word-keeping cost him something. She paused. I walked 3 days to speak to a man I did not know, because Doña Clemencia said he was a man who kept his word. Tomas was quiet for a moment. What do you propose, exactly? He said. Elena looked at him. You have more rooms than you use. You have land that needs work year-round, not only at harvest. I can cook. I can tend a garden. I can keep accounts. Hector taught me because he said a woman who cannot read numbers is a woman other people can cheat. A pause. Mateo is 12. He already helps with accounts better than I do. Sofia works with her hands. And Dieguito. She glanced at her sleeping son with an expression that was part exhaustion and part something that had no clean name. Dieguito is 4 years old and needs to grow up somewhere safe. And what do you want in return? Tomas said. Beyond a roof. A fair wage for the work, Elena said. Not charity. I will not take charity. She said it the way people say things they have been carrying for a long time, not as an attack, but as a boundary, a stake in the ground, clear and unmovable. Tomas looked at his soup. He thought about the 4 chairs around the table, which were currently, for the first time in 11 years, all occupied. He thought about the 12 hectares and the 847 trees and the long months between February pruning and October harvest, when the only voice in this house was his own. He thought about the rose garden behind the east wall with the wire around the latch. There are 3 bedrooms on the upper floor that have been empty for many years, he said finally. They would need airing. The mattresses may need replacement. I haven't looked. He considered. I will give you 30 days. You work, I observe. At the end of 30 days, we decide together whether we are useful to each other. If yes, we make a proper arrangement, in writing, with numbers we both agree on. If no, I give you bus fare to the border and no hard feelings. Elena Vidal looked at him across the pine table for a long moment. That is fair, she said. I know it is, Tomas said. I try to be fair. Neither of them smiled. But neither of them needed to. Outside, the October dark had come fully down over the orange groves, and the first stars were appearing above the eastern ridge. And from the kitchen there came the low sounds of an old man and a young woman finishing their soup in a house that, for the first time in a very long time, had all 4 of its chairs filled. Accounts, arguments, and the education of Canella. The first week was, as all first weeks are, an education in geography. Not the geography of the farm. That Tomas began to teach them on the first full morning, walking the rows slowly with his cane while Mateo followed 2 steps behind with the worn notebook he carried everywhere, recording things without being asked. Tomas told him the row numbers, the tree ages, the yield averages per section, the names of the 4 irrigation channels. Rosa had named them, primero, segundo, cansado, tired, for the one with the weakest flow, and caprichoso, capricious, for the one that ran unpredictably. Mateo wrote all of it down in a handwriting that was too neat for a 12-year-old, with small, neat figures and abbreviations that Tomas noticed were consistent, which meant the boy had his own system of notation and had been using it long enough for it to become habit. "Where did you learn to keep notes like that?" Tomas asked at the end of row 4. "My father showed me," Mateo said. "He said, if you write a thing down, it stops living only in your head where you might lose it, and starts living on the page where you can find it again." Tomas considered this. "Your father was a smart man." "Yes," Mateo said, in the same matter-of-fact tone with which he said everything, the tone of a child who had decided that the only dignified response to loss was precision. The geography they were truly learning that first week was each other's. Tomas learned that Elena rose at 5, 40 minutes before he did, and had the stove going and coffee made before he reached the kitchen. He had not asked her to do this, and she had not announced it. She had simply observed on the first morning that the stove took 12 minutes to heat properly, and that Tomas's body was the kind of body that moved better after coffee than before, and she had drawn the obvious conclusion. He said nothing about it because saying nothing was his way of saying he appreciated it. He learned that Sofia spoke less than Mateo, but saw more. She had a habit of sitting still in corners of rooms and drawing in her sketchbook. She had produced one from the wooden trunk along with 3 short pencils, a rubber eraser worn down to a nub, and a small watercolor set with colors that had been used down to wafers, while adults talked around her, and her drawings were records of what she observed, not fantasies of what she wished she saw. On the second day, Tomas found a sketch of himself on the kitchen table, done with a few dozen economical lines. A man with a cane, slightly bent, his head tilted at the angle it tilted when he was thinking. It was accurate in the way that is faintly unsettling. The way a drawing by someone who truly looks is different from a drawing by someone who simply represents. "Did you mean to leave this?" he asked Sofia at lunch. The girl looked up. "You can keep it if you want," she said. "Or I can put it in my book, it doesn't matter." He kept it. He didn't know why exactly, but he folded it carefully and put it in the drawer of the bedside table, next to the Longines watch and the unopened envelope. He learned that Dieguito was a person of enthusiasms. The enthusiasms changed rapidly and without transition. On Monday, it was the irrigation channels, which he followed for an hour in the company of Canella and an expression of scientific interest. On Tuesday, it was the kitchen garden, where he became convinced that if he watched the chard carefully enough, he could see it grow. On Wednesday, it was the wooden box near the porch where Tomas kept his grafting tools, which he opened and closed repeatedly until Elena gently redirected him. Each enthusiasm was complete in itself and was pursued with total commitment until it was replaced by the next, in the way of 4-year-olds for whom the world is an endless series of primary colors. He had already adopted Canella. Not formally. Canella's loyalty remained rooted in Tomas in the fundamental way of old dogs who have decided their allegiance is a settled matter. But Dieguito had appointed himself Canella's secondary guardian, and Canella, who in her old age had arrived at a profound indifference to most things, had accepted this with the tolerance of a retired sovereign receiving the attentions of a well-meaning minor courtier. Elena, meanwhile, was learning the house. Not as a guest familiarizes herself with borrowed space, but as someone who is taking inventory, where things were kept, what needed repair, what had been left undone because there was no one to do it and no one to notice it undone. The window latch in the upstairs hallway that no longer caught, the step on the back staircase that gave a different sound than the others when you stood on it, the pipe under the kitchen sink that dripped once every 7 minutes into a pan that Tomas emptied every morning without having thought to fix the pipe. She made no list and offered no commentary, but Tomas, who was observant, noticed her noticing. On the 9th day, she fixed the pipe herself. She said nothing about it. He noticed the pan was gone and looked under the sink, and the pipe was wrapped in sealing tape, applied with the neatness of someone who had done it before. He said nothing about it either. But that evening, before he went to bed, he moved the pan from the cabinet under the sink to the high shelf where the winter preserves were kept. because it was no longer needed under the sink. In this way, without discussion, they began to build a grammar. The trouble with the accounts arrived on the 18th day. Tomas kept his farm accounts in a system he had developed over 30 years, a series of ledger books with a logic that made complete sense to him and to no one else, because he had never needed it to make sense to anyone else. The current year's ledger was a thick book with a blue cover that lived on the kitchen table under a clay paperweight shaped like a fish that Rosa had bought at a church fair in 1987. He had shown it to Matteo on the third day as a courtesy. Here is the system, here is the notation, here is what the numbers mean. And Matteo had nodded and asked 2 questions, both precise, and Tomas had thought nothing more of it. On the 18th day, Matteo came to find him in row 7. Tomas had come to notice that Matteo, approaching with his notebook open, was a specific kind of event, different from Matteo simply walking alongside him with the notebook closed. When the notebook was open, there was something he wanted to account for. "Don Tomas," the boy said. He was using the title now. He had started without being asked on about the 4th day, and Elena had not corrected him, which told Tomas it was not something she had instructed. "I found something in the October ledger that I think is wrong." "Show me," Tomas said. Matteo held out the ledger book. He had brought it from the kitchen, carefully, and pointed to an entry near the bottom of the page for October 3rd. It was a record of 2.3 tons of Valencia oranges delivered to the Santa Lucia Cooperative, credited at the standard price of 180 pesos per kilo, which should have yielded a credit of 414,000 pesos. But the number written in the credit column was 404,000 pesos, a difference of 10,000 pesos. "I thought maybe I was miscalculating," Matteo said, "so I did it 3 times. He showed Tomas the back of a page in his own notebook, where indeed the same calculation appeared 3 times in 3 slightly different arrangements, all arriving at the same answer. And then I looked at the cooperative's receipt. He produced the receipt, which had been tucked into the ledger, and which Tomas had filed there himself after the delivery, without checking the arithmetic. The receipt showed the amount received: 404,000 pesos. "The receipt is also wrong," Matteo said. Tomas looked at the receipt. He looked at the ledger. He looked at Matteo's notebook with its 3 identical calculations. He was a man who had been managing numbers for decades and who had clearly been trusting receipts without checking them for longer than he should have, because after 40 years of working with the same cooperative, he had stopped expecting errors. "You're right," he said. He said it simply because it was simply true. The boy had found a discrepancy he had missed, and it was a real discrepancy, and the correct response to that was to acknowledge it. "I thought you should know," Matteo said, with the careful neutrality of someone who had not known how the information would be received and who had brought it anyway. "You did the right thing," Tomas said. "This afternoon we go to Santa Lucia and speak to the cooperative manager." He paused. "You'll come with me and bring your calculations." Matteo straightened slightly, a very small movement, but one that Tomas read as the posture of a 12-year-old who had been told his work mattered. "Yes, Don Tomas," he said. They went that afternoon, Tomas driving the old pickup with Matteo beside him in the passenger seat, the boy's notebook and the cooperative receipt on his lap in the position of evidence. The manager, a man named Villegas, who had known Tomas for 20 years, reviewed the documents with the expression of a man confronting an error he would rather not confront, and ultimately confirmed the discrepancy and issued a correction credit the following week for the 10,000 pesos and a formal apology. On the drive home, Matteo did not say anything for a long time, looking at the road. "In Pozo Hondo," he said eventually, "my father said there were men at the market who made this same kind of mistake with small farmers. Never large amounts, just enough that people felt it wasn't worth arguing about." "Did your father argue about it?" "He did not find it in time," Matteo said simply. Tomas thought about that for the rest of the drive home. When they arrived, he parked the truck and sat for a moment before getting out. "Matteo," he said. Don Tomas, from now on, you check every receipt before we file it. Every one. Not because I can't do it, because 2 sets of eyes are better than 1, and your eyes appear to be a great deal sharper than mine. Mateo looked straight ahead through the windshield for a moment. Yes, he said. All right. They got out of the truck and went inside and said nothing about it to Elena, because neither of them felt any particular need to make a ceremony of what had simply been a thing that needed doing. Sophia's relationship with the farm was a different matter entirely. Where Mateo engaged with systems, numbers, sequences, the logic of cause and effect, Sophia engaged with appearances. She drew everything. The irrigation channels in the early morning when the light came sideways across the water, the specific shape that the oldest tree in row 7 made against the afternoon sky. Canella, asleep near the stove with the exhausted dignity of a noble in retirement. Tomas's hands, twice, once with the cane and once without. She had a particular interest in textures and would sit for 20 minutes pressing her hand against different surfaces, the rough iron of the main gate, the smooth, worn wood of the kitchen table, the bark of the trees in different rows, before drawing them, as if understanding a thing through her palm helped her understand it through her pencil. She was also, it turned out, gifted with plants in a way that was partly knowledge and partly something more difficult to name. On the 12th day, she found a section of the kitchen garden where the cilantro had failed. Not died completely, but grown leggy and pale in a way that suggested the wrong relationship with light, and had, without asking, repositioned 3 of the clay pots to a different angle and introduced a thin cane structure she'd made herself from pruning offcuts, creating a latticed shade over the parsley that she said needed it. Tomas had watched this from the porch and had not commented. A week later, the cilantro was visibly recovering. The parsley was thriving, and Sophia had moved on to the basil with the serene confidence of a person who has always known what things need. Tomas said to Elena one evening, "Your daughter has a way with growing things." Elena looked up from the account she was reviewing. "She always did," she said. "In Pozo Hondo, she kept a window box. She propagated everything from cuttings. She'd find a stem on the roadside and come home with it tucked in her pocket like treasure." She was quiet for a moment. "The window box was the last thing we could not take." Tomas thought about that. He thought about a girl who kept treasure in her pockets and had left her window box behind. He said nothing, but he thought about the rose garden behind the east wall with the wire around the gate. The 30 days ended on a Tuesday. After dinner, rice with beans that Elena had made the way she made everything, without fuss and better than necessary, Tomas put the ledger book on the table between them, along with a single sheet of paper on which he had, in his careful hand, written out 2 columns of numbers. "Left column is what I can pay," he said. "Right column is what I estimate the work is worth at market rates. I want you to see both numbers before we discuss." Elena studied the sheet for a long time. Mateo, who was still at the table finishing a glass of milk, leaned slightly to look at the paper with the involuntary instinct of a boy who reads numbers the way other boys read comic strips. "The left column is lower than the right," Elena said. "By 8%, Tomas said, "because I cannot afford the right column every month in every season, and I will not make a promise I cannot keep. In the good months, when the harvest comes in above 300 tons, I can close the gap. In bad months, I cannot. I am showing you the honest number, not the comfortable number." Elena considered. "The honest number," she said. "Always," Tomas said. "In 30 years of farming, the one thing I've learned is that comfortable numbers come back to find you." Elena looked at the paper for a while longer. Then she said, "I want one condition added." "Tell me." "The wage is the wage, and I am grateful for it. But I want it written that the arrangement is for the benefit of my children as much as for me. That Mateo is learning the accounts as part of his work, not as an add-on. that Sophia's work with the garden is counted as real work with real value. She paused. They are not guests in this house. They are working. I want that written. Tomas looked at her. He picked up his pencil and wrote at the bottom of the sheet in his careful hand. Work of all household members, EV, MV, SV, recognized as contribution of value to Rancho Aguirre, not charity, fair exchange. He turned the paper so she could read it. Elena read it. She did not say anything for a moment. When she looked up, her eyes were the careful eyes of someone who will not cry because they have decided not to. But the decision is recent. That is acceptable, she said. Good, Tomas said. He dated the bottom of the sheet and signed it and pushed it across to Elena, who signed it without hesitation. That was how the arrangement was made. Not with ceremony, not with speeches, but with 2 columns of numbers and 1 condition added at the bottom of the page, witnessed by a 12-year-old boy with a notebook and an old dog near the kitchen stove, who lifted her head briefly at the sound of the paper moving, and then put it back down. From somewhere upstairs, through the ceiling, came the sound of Dieguito talking to himself in his sleep, a low, contented murmur, the sound of a child who has decided without analysis that wherever he is home. What was behind the wire gate? 5 months passed, and the farm taught them the farm. It taught them in the way farms always teach, through the specific, the accumulated, the daily. The irrigation sequence learned not from a chart, but from the moment Fidel arrived in February and raised his eyebrows at the way Mateo had been running it. Slightly wrong in one section, overwatering row 3 at the cost of row 10, and showed him the correction. And the way Mateo came home and corrected his notebook that same afternoon, drawing a revised diagram with a notation that said, adjusted per Fidel, February 14th. The kitchen garden taught Sophia the difference between plants that wanted afternoon shade and plants that needed full morning sun, a distinction she had understood theoretically and now understood in the flesh, because she had made the wrong call twice with the epazote before she understood it in the way that only a mistake can teach. The pickup truck taught Elena the back road to Santa Lucia, 7 kilometers shorter than the main road, but impassable in rain. A fact she discovered on a wet March afternoon and stored without complaint. And the farm taught Tomas something too, though he would not have named it easily, and would have been embarrassed if anyone had tried. It taught him that a house with sound in it worked differently than a house without sound. Not the sounds he'd expected to notice, not the footsteps on the upper floor or the voices at meals or the occasional argument between Mateo and Sofia that blazed and extinguished within 15 minutes like small, clean fires. Those he had noticed immediately in the first days, with the mild disorientation of a man whose ears have relearned how to hear. What he noticed later, gradually, was different. The particular silence that fell when the children were all asleep and Elena was reading at the kitchen table, which was a different silence than the silence of a house with no one in it. The specific sound of Dieguito talking to Canela, not trying to get a response, simply narrating his thoughts into the direction of the dog's large, patient ears, which occurred every morning while Elena made breakfast, a 30-minute daily radio broadcast directed at an audience of 1 elderly dog. The way the house breathed differently when it was full. He had not realized, in 11 years alone, that a house breathed at all. The rose garden had been locked for 11 years, 2 months, and 8 days when Sofia found the gate. It was a Saturday in early April. Tomas had asked Mateo to help him check the irrigation valves on the east side of the property, which was work enough for 2, and Elena had taken Dieguito to the kitchen garden to harvest the first spring lettuce, and Sofia, whose Saturday mornings were her own, had wandered with her sketchbook to the area behind the east wall that she had noticed but not yet fully explored. The wall was old stone, plastered and replastered so many times that its surface was a record of many decades, smooth here, rough there, cracked in one long diagonal fault that had been patched with a slightly different shade of plaster sometime in the 1990s and never quite matched. The gate in the wall was iron, narrower than the main gate, and wound around its latch was a length of galvanized wire that had oxidized to a dull rust orange. Behind the gate, visible through the iron bars, was a tangle of rose canes, tall, overlong, unpruned, some of them 2 meters high and arching over themselves under their own weight, like old men who have given up on posture. There were leaves, in the early spring abundance of plants that grow because that is what they do, regardless of whether anyone is watching. There were no blooms yet because it was too early in the season, but on several canes Tomas could see, if he looked, the small, closed knuckles of buds that would open in May if the temperatures held. Sophia looked at it for a long time through the iron bars. Then she went and found Tomas. He was at the far end of the east irrigation channel with Mateo crouched, awkwardly because of his knees, examining the seal on valve number 3, which had been dripping since the previous week. "Don Tomas," Sophia said. He straightened, taking more time than he used to. "What is it?" "The garden behind the wall," she said, "with the wire on the gate." Something in his body did the thing that bodies do when they hear a thing they have been not listening for. A slight change in weight, in breath. "What about it?" he said. Sophia did not ask if she could open the gate. She was not, Tomas had learned, a child who asked permission for observations. "The roses haven't been pruned in a very long time," she said. "I can see some of the canes are crossing each other, which means they'll wound themselves when the wind moves them. And some of the oldest canes are woody and not going to produce anymore." A pause. "I could fix it, if you wanted me to. I know roses." "How do you know roses?" Tomas asked. "My abuela in Pozo Hondo had them," Sophia said. "She taught me before she died. She said, you have to cut roses hard to make them bloom hard. She said it's the same with people, but she never explained how." Tomas stood with his cane and looked at his valve and looked at Mateo, who was looking at the valve with deliberate attention, the way people look at things that are not the thing they are thinking about. "The wire on the gate," Tomas said finally. "I put it there because I wasn't ready to go in." Sophia considered this. "Are you ready now?" The question was direct without being unkind, in the way of children who have not yet learned that direct questions make adults uncomfortable. Tomas thought about 11 years. He thought about the way the rose garden had looked when Rosa kept it, the smell of it in May, the pink climbing roses on the south-facing section, the yellow hybrid teas she'd been proudest of, the white ones she called las novias, the brides, that bloomed in June and September. He thought about how he had walked past the gate every day for 4,000 and some days and had never unwound the wire. "Not exactly," he said, "but maybe close enough." He walked to the gate with his cane and stood in front of it and unwound the wire with his hands. It took a minute. His hands were not as quick as they had been, and the wire had corroded slightly into its own coils. But he unwound it, and he pushed open the gate, and it moved on its hinges with less resistance than he had expected, because the hinges were good iron, and Rosa had always oiled them herself. Inside, the garden was overgrown and beautiful, the way things are beautiful when they have been left alone to be what they are without direction. The rose canes rose in great arching tangles, the unpruned wood of 11 years building on itself, creating a structure that was more sculpture than garden. The stone path Rosa had laid herself, one flagstone at a time, was visible in places and swallowed by growth in others. The small iron bench she had kept near the south wall was there, rusted to the dark orange of old blood, with a fall of climbing rose canes draped over its back like a shawl. Tomas stood inside the gate and did not move. Sophia stood beside him. She did not speak. After a while, 2 minutes or 5, Tomas could not have said, he said, "Her name was Rosa." "I know," Sophia said. "Mateo told me." "She planted these herself," Tomas said. "Every one of them. She ordered them from a catalogue and she drew a plan on graph paper and she planted them in the right moon phases, which I told her was superstition, and she told me that all farming is a negotiation with things you cannot control, so you might as well negotiate respectfully. He was quiet. She was right, as she was about most things. Sophia was looking at the roses with the professional attention she brought to all plants, taking inventory. "There are at least 40 plants still alive," she said. "Maybe more. The rootstock is healthy. I can see new growth at the base of even the oldest canes. They've been surviving without care for a long time, which means they were well established before." She turned to look at him. "They want to bloom. They just need someone to let them." Tomas looked at the garden for a long time. "Then let them," he said. He told her about Rosa that evening. Not the whole story. No one tells the whole story of a person in a single evening. And Tomas was not a man for whom telling came easily in any case. But after dinner, while Elena washed dishes and Mateo worked at the table and Dieguito slept upstairs in his accustomed early oblivion, Sophia sat across from Tomas with her sketchbook open and her pencil moving quietly. And Tomas found that he was talking. He told her that Rosa had come from a town 200 kilometers to the west, that she had been the daughter of a school teacher and a baker, that she had married Tomas when she was 23, and had thought she was marrying a boring man because he was quiet, and she had discovered, gradually, that quiet and boring are not the same thing. He told her that Rosa had kept the farm's accounts for 20 years before her eyesight began to fail her, and that she had an instinct for numbers that expressed itself not in ledgers, but in estimates. She could look at a row of trees and tell you within 5% what they would yield that season, a skill that Tomas had never been able to replicate. He told her that Rosa had grown the roses because she believed every useful property needed something that served no purpose except beauty, and that this belief had seemed impractical to him for 30 years and had seemed, in the 11 years of her absence, increasingly wise. He told her about Miguel, briefly, in the way a man tells a painful thing when he has decided that the pain does not excuse the silence. He said that Miguel had had Rosa's talent for numbers and Tomas's stubbornness, a combination that had made him excellent at argument and terrible at compromise, and that Tomas had sometimes wondered if the stubbornness had sent him north to the mines rather than staying to work a farm he might have found too quiet. He said he had made peace with wondering about it, because the alternative was not making peace, and not making peace cost more than a man could afford. Sophia listened and drew. When he finished, she turned her sketchbook and showed him what she had drawn during his talking. Not his face this time, but a pair of hands. His hands, at rest on the table, one loosely holding his empty coffee cup with the slight curve in the right index finger where he had broken it decades ago, and it had healed crooked. They were old hands, drawn with affection and precision, the way someone draws something they value. "I'll start on the roses next week," she said. "I'll need proper pruning shears if the ones in the shed are too dull." "I'll get them in Santa Lucia on Wednesday," Tomas said. Neither of them said anything about the conversation they had just had because neither of them needed to. The heart attack. Tomas's doctor in Santa Lucia insisted on calling it un evento cardíaco menor, a minor cardiac event, which Tomas found infuriating in the same way that being told a fall is a minor gravitational incident would have been infuriating. Happened on a Friday night in mid-May, 4 weeks after the rose garden was opened. He had been in bed for 20 minutes, reading, when the feeling arrived that was not quite pain and not quite pressure, but that he had been warned about in terms specific enough that he recognized it immediately. He put down the book. He waited for 30 seconds to be certain. He was certain. The problem was that his body was not cooperating with the logistics of responding. He could sit up with difficulty. He could not be sure he could stand without the kind of delay that he did not have. His phone was on the bedside table and he reached for it, and his hands were cooperating less than usual. He managed to open the door of his bedroom and to call, not loudly because his breath was behaving badly, but loudly enough. Elena was there in 40 seconds. He knew it was 40 seconds because he had been counting. in the methodical way his mind resorted to when it needed something to hold on to, and she arrived at the bedroom door at 40, barefoot, in the dark clothes she slept in, fully awake in the immediate way of women who sleep lightly because they have always needed to. She took in the situation in a single look. "Tell me what you're feeling," she said. Not a question exactly. An instruction, he told her. Chest, jaw, left arm. She asked 3 more questions, precise ones, then said, "I'm getting the truck. Mateo will stay with the children. Don't try to stand up yet." She was gone before he could respond. He heard her voice in the hallway, low and clear, then Mateo's voice, then the sound of her feet on the stairs. When she came back, she was wearing shoes and had brought his jacket from the hook behind the door and his cane from where it leaned beside the bedside table. Getting Tomas to the truck required getting Tomas down the stairs, which required Tomas's cooperation and Elena's shoulder, and they managed it in a way that Tomas would later describe only as adequate, and that Elena would never describe at all, because she understood instinctively that a man of Tomas Aguirre's nature did not wish to discuss the logistics of having been carried. It was 3 in the morning. The road to Santa Lucia in the dark was 45 minutes if you drove at the speed the road permitted. Elena drove it in 32 minutes. Tomas was aware of the speed, peripherally, and did not comment on it because the part of him that would normally have commented on driving speed was occupied with other things. She did not talk during the drive, which he appreciated. She drove with both hands on the wheel and her eyes on the road, and occasionally glanced at him with the specific glance of someone monitoring a situation, and he found the monitoring neither offensive nor reassuring, but simply accurate. The situation warranted monitoring. At the hospital in Santa Lucia, a small public hospital with a 20-bed ward and an emergency room that was adequate on most nights, Elena brought the truck to the entrance and had a nurse at Tomas's side before he had finished getting out of the vehicle. She answered the intake questions in his place when he answered them too slowly, because she had paid attention during the drive to the things he had told her and had retained them. She sat in the waiting room for 4 hours without sleeping and without asking to be told anything she wasn't going to be told yet. The doctor, at 6 in the morning, young, tired, competent, confirmed the evento cardíaco menor and provided instructions. Rest, medication adjustments, a follow-up in 2 weeks, a diet modification that Tomas received with the expression of a man who has heard this before and will take it more seriously this time. On the drive home, with the early light coming across the road and the orange groves visible in the distance, Tomas said, "You drove very fast." "You needed to get there quickly," Elena said. "I know," he said. "I'm not complaining." A pause. "You didn't panic," he said. "No." "Most people would have panicked." Elena kept her eyes on the road. "Hector's fever came on fast," she said. "In the middle of the night. There was no one to drive us, no truck, nothing. I ran 1.5 kilometers to the nearest telephone." A long pause. "I learned that night that panicking costs time you don't have." Tomas was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said. "About Hector." "I know you are," she said. "You've said so, and I know you mean it." They drove the rest of the way home in the particular silence of people who have been through something together and don't need to name it. When they arrived, Mateo was on the porch with all 3 children, the 2 older ones on either side of him and Dieguito on his lap, the 4 of them arranged in the posture of people who have been waiting. When the truck stopped, Dieguito slid off Mateo's lap and came to meet Tomas at the truck door with a look of such unaffected relief that it arrived somewhere in Tomas's chest with the weight of something much larger than a 4-year-old. "Abuelito," Dieguito said. He had started saying it 2 weeks before, with no announcement and no apparent awareness that it was a new word, and Tomas had not corrected it. "I'm all right," Tomas said. "Go back to bed." "It's morning," Dieguito said reasonably. "Then go have breakfast," Tomas said. "I'll be in shortly." He went upstairs slowly, with his cane and the handrail and considerably more care than usual. From the kitchen came the sound of Elena already making coffee, the sound of the stove being lit. From the porch, Dieguito's voice explaining something to Canella. In his bedroom, Tomas sat on the edge of the bed and opened the bedside table drawer. He looked at the Longines watch for a long time. Then he took it out and put it on, and found that it still kept good time. A document and a visitor. On a Tuesday in early June, 3 weeks after the event Tomas had decided to call simply the night of the truck, he drove himself to Santa Lucia for his follow-up appointment with Dr. Fuentes, and on the way home, he stopped at the office of a lawyer named Licenciado Guerrero. He had been thinking about what he wanted to do since before the cardiac event, if he was honest with himself. The event had simply clarified the thinking in the way that physical reminders of mortality tend to clarify thinking. Not by introducing new ideas, but by removing the reasons one finds for delaying the ideas one already has. Licenciado Guerrero was 61 years old, a compact man with silver hair and the manner of someone who has heard a great many of his clients' private arrangements without expressing opinion on any of them. He had drafted Tomas's will 16 years ago, after Rosa's death, and had seen him twice since then for minor matters. He poured coffee from a machine on the shelf behind his desk and asked Tomas what he needed. Tomas explained, carefully, because he had prepared what he wanted to say. He wanted 2 documents. The first, a formal labor agreement for Elena Vidal and her dependent children, specifying wages, duties, and conditions of employment at Rancho Aguirre, backdated to the date of the signed kitchen table agreement, which he had brought with him. The second, an amendment to his existing will, specifically a conditional inheritance clause establishing that in the event of his death, if Elena Vidal or her children had been residing at and working the property continuously for 5 or more years, a specified portion of the property, the house, the rose garden, and 4 hectares of the orange grove, the east half, would pass to Elena Vidal in trust for her children, free of encumbrance. Licenciado Guerrero listened without interrupting. When Tomas finished, the lawyer set down his coffee cup and said, "This is a significant disposition. You have other heirs?" "A great-nephew," Tomas said. "Ramiro Aguirre. He lives in the capital. He has my current address and phone number. He has called me twice in 3 years." He looked at the lawyer steadily. "I want the document to be unambiguous. Not cruel. I am not trying to punish him, but clear. The property has been built over 2 lifetimes of work. It should pass to the people who will work it." "Is there a concern about a challenge?" the lawyer asked. "There is a concern about a visitor," Tomas said. The lawyer nodded and made notes. They spent an hour discussing the specific language of the conditional clause, the documentation of continuous residence and employment that would be required to activate it, the specific parcels and their surveyed boundaries. Tomas had brought the property maps in a tube he kept under the truck seat, and they spread them on the desk and worked through the details with the careful attention of men who understand that imprecision in documents causes more harm than imprecision in speech. He paid the lawyer's retainer, drove home, and put the copies of both documents in the drawer of the kitchen dresser, behind the folder where he kept the farm's insurance papers. He said nothing to Elena that evening. He had not yet decided how to tell her, and he was a man who did not speak about things until he knew what he wanted to say. He would tell her when the time was appropriate. In the meantime, the document existed. Ramiro Aguirre arrived on a Thursday in July, a day on which the temperature had climbed to 37 degrees, and the air over the orange groves shimmered in the way that meant the irrigation needed attention. He came in a silver SUV with city plates, which Tomas saw from row 4 before he heard the horn at the gate. He was 42 years old, Tomas's brother's daughter's son, a connection removed enough that great-nephew was the closest available English term for a relationship that, in this family, had always been maintained at the level of Christmas cards and occasional calls during major illness. He was not a bad man, Tomas had decided over the years. He was a man who had left the provinces for the city at 20 and had succeeded there by the city's definitions, which meant he had a car and a suit and the manner of a person for whom things had worked out in ways that made the working out of other people's things seem, in comparison, like a simpler problem. He was not cruel. He was not attentive. He called twice a year with the regularity of someone executing a calendar reminder. He came through the gate with his hand extended and a smile that was not insincere, but that arrived before his eyes did, which is a particular kind of smile Tomas had learned to read over 78 years. "Tio Tomas," he said, using the title in the loose way the family used it. Not technically accurate, but affectionate, or performing affection. "You look well. The country air." "The country air is the same as always," Tomas said. They shook hands. "Come in. It's too hot to stand in the grove." In the kitchen, Elena was making lunch. She had heard the car and had set a fourth place at the table before Tomas could ask her to, which was the kind of thing she did that he had stopped noting as unusual and had started noting only when it didn't happen. Mateo was at the table with his notebook. Sofia was not inside. She was in the rose garden, where she spent most of her late mornings, and Dieguito was with Canela on the porch. Ramiro observed the kitchen with the careful non-observation of a person cataloging things while pretending not to. Tomas watched him observe. The notebooks on the table, the 4 chairs all occupied, the woman moving competently around his kitchen, the children who were clearly at home in the space. "You have company," Ramiro said pleasantly. "I have family," Tomas said. A brief pause in which Ramiro's smile did not change, but his eyes did, slightly. "Family," he repeated. "Sit down," Tomas said. "Elena, this is my great-nephew Ramiro from the capital. Ramiro, this is Elena Vidal, who manages the household and the accounts. And that is Mateo, who handles the delivery records." Mateo looked up and said, "Buenos dias," and returned to his notebook. Elena brought coffee and tortillas and served them with the naturalness of someone who is neither performing hospitality nor resenting it. The conversation over lunch was pleasant in the way of conversations between people who are not saying what they are thinking. Ramiro asked about the farm's harvest, how many tons this season, what the cooperative was paying per kilo, whether the trees in the older rows were still producing well. He asked these questions in the tone of a man who is mildly curious, which was a tone Tomas had heard from vendors trying to establish a price before naming one. "The east section has been the strongest producer this year," Tomas said. "We're looking at 290 tons minimum. If the rains hold another 3 weeks, possibly 310. "That's good," Ramiro said. "Very good. And the land itself, have you had it valued recently? I only ask because the agricultural land prices in this region have gone up considerably. A cousin was telling me—" "I know the value of the land," Tomas said pleasantly. "Of course," Ramiro said. "Of course you do." After lunch, Ramiro asked to walk the property. Tomas walked it with him, cane in hand, row by row. Ramiro walked with his phone in his hand, which he glanced at occasionally in the way people glance at phones when they are calculating things they don't want to appear to be calculating. He said the right things about the trees, asked the right questions about the irrigation, but at the boundary of the east section, the section specified in the conditional inheritance clause, he paused and looked back toward the house. "A big operation for one man," he said. "That's why I don't operate it alone," Tomas said. Another pause. "Deal," Ramiro said, and his tone shifted slightly. Not much, but enough toward the gentle concern that is sometimes genuine and sometimes the approach to another topic. "I want to ask, only because I care. These people, the woman and her children, you've known them how long? 8 months?" 9, Tomas said. "And you trust them? With the accounts? With everything?" "More than I trust most people I've known for 40 years, Tomas said. Mateo caught a discrepancy in the cooperative receipts in his first month here that I had been missing for years. Elena took me to the hospital in the middle of the night in May and didn't panic and didn't leave. Sofia has restored my wife's rose garden. He looked at Ramiro steadily. These are not hypothetical trust questions. I know these people. Ramiro nodded, slowly, with the expression of a man receiving information that is not what he came to receive. I only ask because, legally, without proper arrangements— The arrangements are proper, Tomas said. They have been documented and filed. A silence. Around them, the orange trees held their fruit, heavy and orange and patient. I see, Ramiro said. I expect you do, Tomas said. They walked back to the house in the kind of quiet that has content in it. Ramiro stayed for coffee after the walk and was pleasant and unhurried, and when he left at 4 o'clock he embraced Tomas at the gate and said he was glad to see him looking well, and that he hoped the harvest went smoothly. He said nothing specific, he did nothing threatening. He was, in all observable ways, a man paying a family visit. But as he backed the silver SUV out of the gate and turned onto the road, he paused with the window down and said, with a smile that was almost but not quite casual, "We should talk more, Tio. About the future, about plans." He said it gently. He said it to the air, the way people say things they want heard but not discussed. Then he raised his hand in a wave and drove away down the dirt road, the silver car throwing up a trail of dry dust that lingered in the afternoon heat long after the sound of the engine was gone. Tomas stood at his gate and watched the dust settle. Inside, he heard the Aguito explaining to Canela that the shiny car had gone, in the tone of someone delivering news of minor cosmic significance. He heard Elena's voice in the kitchen, the sound of dishes. He heard from behind the east wall the quiet sounds of Sofia working in the rose garden, the clip of shears, the soft fall of cut stems. He was not afraid, but he was attentive. He turned and walked back up the path to the house, and the gate creaked behind him in its customary way, a creak that he had heard 10,000 times and that sounded this evening neither like a question nor like an answer, but like the sound of a door doing what it was made to do, marking a boundary between what was outside and what was in. The years that follow one. Ramiro came back in September. You came on a Saturday, which was different from the weekday visit in July, and he came earlier, at 9 in the morning, before the household had fully settled into the day's rhythm. He came, this time, without the pleasant ambiguity of the July visit. He came with a folder under his arm and the expression of a man who has spent 2 months in the city consulting with someone and has arrived at a position. Tomas was in the kitchen when he heard the gate, and he was at the porch when Ramiro came up the path. He had his coffee in one hand and his cane hooked on the porch railing, and the morning was still cool in the way September mornings are cool when autumn is beginning to think about itself. "Tio Tomas," Ramiro said. "Ramiro," Tomas said. "Come in." They sat at the kitchen table. Elena brought coffee and then took the Aguito and left without being asked to, which was— Tomas had long since stopped being surprised by Elena's readings of rooms— exactly the right thing. Mateo, whose Saturday morning place was the kitchen table with his notebook, closed the notebook and left as well, though more slowly, with the deliberate unhurry of a 12-year-old who wants to convey that he is leaving because he chooses to, not because he's been moved. Ramiro set the folder on the table. He did not open it immediately. He looked at Tomas with the expression of a man who has prepared a thing and is experiencing, at the moment of delivery, the slight deflation of finding the other person has already prepared for it. "I want to have an honest conversation," Ramiro said. "That's a good kind to have," Tomas said. I have been speaking to my mother, and to Cousin Adela in Monterey, and to a lawyer friend of mine in the capital." He paused. "The family feels— we feel—" "Tell me what you want to say, Ramiro," Tomas said, not unkindly. "You've never been a man who benefits from a long approach." Ramiro looked at the folder. "The family feels that at your age, with your health, There are decisions being made here that affect everyone, and that perhaps some of those decisions deserve a broader conversation. Which decisions? Tomas said. Ramiro opened the folder. Inside were papers, some photocopied, some printed, the kinds of papers that a lawyer produces when asked to research a property situation. The disposition of the Rancho Aguirre property, he said. If something were to happen to you, the existing will has been amended, Tomas said. A pause. Amended, Ramiro said. Yes. Tomas put down his coffee cup. In June, by Licenciado Guerrero, who has managed my legal affairs for 20 years. The amendment is filed with the civil registry and notarized. There is a copy in my dresser drawer, and the copy with the Licenciado, and the copy with a second lawyer I asked Guerrero to recommend, for redundancy. Ramiro was very still. The amendment establishes a conditional inheritance, Tomas continued, contingent on continuous residence and employment of no less than 5 years. Elena Vidal and her children are entitled to the east half of the grove and the house and its immediate grounds upon my death. The west grove and the commercial rights to the cooperative contract remain with the estate, to be administered by the Licenciado. He looked at Ramiro. You and your mother and cousin Adela are named in a separate bequest, a cash amount, modest but not insulting, which I have set aside and which is specified in the will. You will not receive the land. You were never going to receive the land, Ramiro. You have not set foot here in 4 years. Ramiro was quiet for what felt like a long time. The family, he began. Ramiro. Tomas's voice was not raised, not hard, but it had the quality of stone. Your mother called me twice in the last 11 years. Once when your father died, for which I am grateful, and once 3 months ago to ask about the farm. Your cousin Adela sends a card at Christmas, which I read and appreciate. You called twice in 3 years until you heard I had people here, and then you came in July and asked the price of the land. He paused. I am not angry about any of this. I understand how cities work, and I understand how families drift. And I understand that the people in this house are strangers to you, and that strangers can seem like a threat. But these strangers fed me every day for 9 months, and drove me to the hospital at 3 in the morning, and tended my wife's roses, which had been locked and dying for 11 years. His voice did not change. The document exists. The conditions are clear. There is nothing to contest, because there is nothing ambiguous. He reached across the table and, without ceremony, picked up the folder Ramiro had brought and set it to one side. Drink your coffee, he said. Elena made it strong because she heard the car, and she always makes it strong for guests in the morning. Ramiro sat across the table from his great-uncle for a long moment. He was, Tomas could see, doing a kind of arithmetic, the arithmetic of a man calculating his options and finding them fewer than he had expected. The folder sat at the edge of the table, closed. Then something went out of Ramiro's posture. Not the dignity, he was too practiced for that, but the particular tension of a man holding a position he has now been told is untenable. He picked up his coffee cup. She does make it strong, he said. Yes, Tomas said. They drank their coffee. After a while, Ramiro talked about his mother's health, which was not good. An arthritis problem in her hands that was limiting her work as a seamstress. And Tomas listened and asked questions with the attention he gave to all things worth attending to. They talked for 40 minutes. At the end, Ramiro took his folder and stood and said he hoped the harvest would be good, and Tomas said he expected it would be. They embraced at the porch, and Tomas watched him go to the gate and drive away. And this time the dust behind the silver car settled more quickly. He stood at the porch for a while after. From the rose garden came the sound of Sophia's shears. From the kitchen came the sound of Elena beginning lunch. Dieguito appeared from somewhere with a handful of orange leaves he had collected, presenting them to Canella with the gravity of a 4-year-old who has brought tribute. Ramiro did not come back. The following December, he sent a Christmas card. Tomas sent one in return. The document stayed in the dresser drawer behind the insurance folder, and the world continued. 2. Time does not pass in a single motion. It passes in the specific, in the accumulation of harvests and seasons and mornings and the gradual education of people by the things they love. The harvest of that first full year, October of the year the Vidals arrived, came in at 304 tons, which was above average, and Mateo was present for all 3 days of the cooperative weighing and checked every ticket in the way he had been checking every ticket since September. And the numbers were correct. He wrote the final total in his notebook with a notation that said simply 304.2 T, clean, and showed it to Tomas with the expression of a person presenting a clean bill of health for something they have cared for. Tomas told Gerardo and Fidel and Beto during the harvest that Mateo would be joining them as a junior supervisor. Gerardo, who had 22 years of accumulated opinion about everything, looked at the 12-year-old boy for a long moment and then said, "Can he lift?" Tomas said, "Not the point." Gerardo considered and said, "Fair enough." By the end of the harvest week, Mateo had achieved something more useful than Gerardo's approval. He had achieved Gerardo's respect, which is different and harder. By being the first person in 3 years to catch a packing error in row 12 before it went on the truck. The second year, Mateo was 13 and managing the cooperative correspondence himself, in a handwriting that had grown from neat to authoritative, with a vocabulary of terms that he had acquired partly from Tomas and partly from a book about agricultural economics he had found in the Santa Lucia library, and borrowed so many times that the librarian finally told him to keep it. The third year, he was 14, and he began waking at 5 without being told, before even Elena, and walking row 1 at 5:30 with a flashlight in the cold of early spring to check the soil moisture in the way Tomas had shown him. "He's going to be a better farmer than either of us," Elena said to Tomas one evening in the third year, with a matter-of-fact pride that was the particular pride of a parent watching a child become something specific. "He's going to be a better farmer than most people in this valley," Tomas said, "but don't tell him yet. He's still at the age where the knowledge should come from the work, not from being told." Elena looked at him with an expression she occasionally had, the expression of a woman recognizing a piece of wisdom she has also arrived at independently and is glad to find confirmed. Sophia's roses bloomed that first May. Not all of them. The heavily pruned plants needed a season to recover their flowering strength, and Sophia had explained this to Tomas with the patience of someone translating between languages. But enough of them to fill the garden with color. The yellow hybrid teas Rosa had been proudest of, the pink climbers on the south wall, and, most unexpectedly, a small cluster of white roses in the northwest corner that Sophia had not found in any of the plans Rosa had apparently sketched in an old notebook. The notebook was in the dresser drawer, and Sophia had asked permission to consult it, and Tomas had given it. "These weren't on her plan," Sophia told Tomas, standing in the garden in the May warmth with a cut stem of white rose in her hand. "They must have seeded themselves from the hedge. They're not a named variety. They're just something that decided to grow here." Tomas looked at the white roses. "Las novias," he thought. Rosa's brides, though these were not the ones Rosa had planted. "Some things," he said, "grow where they decide to grow." Sophia put the stem in the clay pot she used for cuttings. "I'm going to propagate them," she said, "if that's all right." "Everything in this garden is yours to tend," he said. It was, he realized as he said it, the first time he had said anything like it about anything of Rosa's. He had not meant it as a momentous thing, but it was, quietly, the most open he had been about the garden since the day he'd unwound the wire from the gate. By the fourth year, Sophia was 11 years old, and the rose garden was a different place. Full, structured, the canes properly trained on the south wall, the paths Rosa had laid clear and maintained. the iron bench refinished with a pot of rust-converting paint that Sofia had purchased in Santa Lucia with 3 months of the pocket money Tomas had begun paying the children for their weekend work. The bench was now the color of old copper, which was not the color it had been. But Sofia had asked Tomas what he thought, and he had said it looked like a bench that intended to stay, and Sofia had taken that as approval. People in Santa Lucia had begun to notice the roses. Word of a garden travels in small towns in the way of all beautiful things, incrementally, from person to person, until suddenly it is a thing everyone knows. A woman who grew flowers for the Santa Lucia church market drove out to the rancho in the 4th year to ask if she could buy cuttings, and Sofia had sold her 12 rose cuttings at a price she had determined herself after researching market rates with the same methodical thoroughness Mateo applied to cooperative prices. She had shown Tomas her pricing spreadsheet. She had made it in a notebook with columns for variety, growth stage, and market comparisons before the transaction. And Tomas had studied it and said, "You undervalued the climbers." And Sofia had looked at the notebook and said, "By how much?" And he had told her, and she had adjusted the price without argument and added a note to the column. From that point, the cuttings were a modest but consistent source of income, separate from the farm's accounts but maintained with the same rigor that everything in Rancho Aguirre was now maintained. By the 5th year, the Aguito was 9 years old. He was at this point fluent in the specific language of the farm, the names of the rows, the irrigation cycle, the Spanish names of every plant in the kitchen garden, the difference between the sound Canela made when she wanted to go outside and the sound she made when she wanted to be left alone. He had named all 847 trees. Not individually, there were too many for that, and he understood vaguely that this was impractical, but by row, giving each row a character. Row 7 was El Abuelo, after the oldest trees. Row 3 was Caprichoso, after the irrigation channel. Row 12 was El Mentiroso, the liar, because it had once produced a yield that Mateo had said was suspicious. He called Tomas Abuelo, consistently, completely, in the way that children commit to language once they have chosen it. He had apparently decided this was accurate and saw no reason to revisit the decision. Tomas, for his part, had stopped flinching at it sometime in the 2nd year and had begun privately to find it the most natural-sounding word in his daily life. 3. In the January of the 6th year, Tomas had a second cardiac event. This one was what his doctor, with the professional regret of someone abandoning euphemism, called significant. He spent 9 days in the Santa Lucia hospital. Elena was there every day. She drove in the mornings and returned in the afternoons in time to be at the farm when the children came home from school. Mateo drove himself on the 3rd day in the farm pickup. He had been practicing in the backfield since he was 13, and he was 16 now, and Elena had let him go without comment beyond, "Drive slowly on the road, not only in the fields," which was her way of giving permission and instruction simultaneously. He sat beside Tomas's bed for 2 hours and mostly did not talk, but brought his notebook and occasionally read out numbers from the farm accounts that required decisions, which Tomas gave in the manner of a man who finds it easier to be sick if the farm is being attended to. Sofia brought roses on the 2nd visit, not cut, a small potted climber, a cutting she had rooted herself in a clay pot painted with a design she had added in the margin of her sketchbook and then transferred to the clay. She put it on the windowsill of his room without ceremony. "That's a hospital room," Tomas said. "Now it has a rose in it," Sofia said. He came home on the 9th day with a new medication and a revised assessment of what his body was willing to do without negotiation. His heart, Dr. Fuentes explained, was managing. It had always been managing, but management now required more conscious accommodation. He listened and understood and was, privately, readying himself for what he had been thinking about in 9 days of hospital ceiling. On a Thursday evening, in his 2nd week home, he asked Elena to sit at the kitchen table after dinner. The children were doing homework upstairs. Mateo, at 16, had begun a correspondence course in agricultural accounting. Sophia was working through a library book on plant propagation. Dieguito was doing primary school work with the desk-bound restlessness of a 9-year-old who thinks better outdoors. He put 2 folders on the table. The first was a copy of the amended will. The second was a new document he had asked Licenciado Guerrero to prepare during his hospital stay, via a phone call from his room. "You need to know what these say," he said. Elena looked at the folders, but did not touch them. "The first is the will," Tomas said. "You have been here 6 years. The conditional clause has been met. If I die today, the East Grove and the house pass to you in trust for the children. The West Grove is managed by the estate and provides income to the trust until Mateo is 25, at which point administration transfers to him." He paused. "This is not charity. You have worked for 6 years, and Mateo has worked since he was 12, and Sophia has restored something I could not restore myself. And Dieguito has named every row of my trees. The land should go to the people who know it." Elena was very still. "The second document," Tomas continued, "is a directive. It specifies that I want to die here, not in the Santa Lucia hospital. It says who has the authority to make medical decisions if I cannot, and that person is you." He looked at her steadily. "I need you to know that, and I need you to accept it, because that authority is only useful if the person holding it knows she holds it." Elena looked at the 2 folders for a long time. Her hands were on the table, not touching them. "Why are you telling me this now?" she said. "Because 9 days in a hospital gives you time to think about what you've delayed," Tomas said. "And I've delayed this conversation for reasons that had more to do with stubbornness than wisdom." A silence. "You should have told me about the will earlier," Elena said. Not reproachfully, as a statement of accurate accounting. "Yes," Tomas said, "I should have. I was private about it, unnecessarily." Elena looked at the folders, then she opened the first one and read it, slowly, carefully, in the way she read everything, making sure she understood each provision. She asked 2 questions, both precise. Tomas answered them. She closed the folder and sat back. "I accept the medical authority," she said, "and I want you to know, not because of this," she touched the folder briefly, "but because it's true. I would have done what I've done here regardless. The arrangement was fair from the beginning, and we've honored it. And this is our home." "I know that," Tomas said. "I know you know," she said, "but I wanted to say it out loud." They sat at the kitchen table for a while after, in the kitchen where they had eaten thousands of meals, with the clay pot on the wall hook and the ledger book stacked at the end of the table, and Canella asleep near the stove, her white muzzle resting on her paws, her breathing slow and deep and entirely at peace. Canella died in March of that year. She was 14 years old, which her veterinarian said was remarkable, and she died in the way she had lived, without fuss, in her customary place near the stove, going from sleep to not sleep in the way that is indistinguishable from the outside. Dieguito, who found her in the morning, was 9 years old and had not encountered death before in a form this close, and he cried with the total sincerity of a child for whom grief has not yet learned to be ashamed of itself. Tomas sat with him on the porch and said that Canella had been old and had not suffered, and had been surrounded by people she loved for all of her life, and that this was more than most of us could count on, and that grief for a thing you loved was appropriate and should not be hurried. Dieguito wiped his face with his sleeve and said, "Did she know she was loved?" Tomas thought about this seriously, the way he thought about all questions that deserved a serious answer. "Dogs know it differently than people do," he said. "Not in words. In warmth, in proximity, in consistency. She slept by that stove for 12 years because this house was warm and consistent. I think that was enough." He put his hand briefly on the boy's shoulder. "More than enough." They buried Canella in the corner of the rose garden under the climbing rose on the south wall, because Sophia said it was the warmest corner of the garden, and Dieguito said Canella had always liked warm places, and that was settled. Tomás died on a Tuesday in November, in the 7th year. He died in his own bed, in the room where the Longines watch lived in the bedside drawer, and Sophia's drawing of his hands was now framed on the wall. Elena had framed it, quietly, sometime in the 3rd year, and he had noticed it and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. He died in the morning, when the light from the east window was the pale gold of early November in the orange groves, the light that had told him all his life that it was 7 o'clock, the light that the trees made when the season was turning and the fruit was heavy and the world was in the equilibrium of a good harvest year. He was not alone. Elena was there, sitting in the chair beside the bed. She had slept in it the last 3 nights because she had understood before he had that the 3rd night would be needed. Mateo was there, 17 years old and taller than his father had been, and precise in all things still, standing near the window with his hands clasped in front of him in the way he stood when he was holding himself very still. Sophia was there, 15, with her sketchbook but not drawing, her hands open in her lap. Dieguito was there, 9 years old, sitting on the edge of the bed beside Tomás in the way he had been sitting since he was 4 and had climbed onto his grandfather's lap while the man slept. Tomás had been drifting in and out of the drowsiness that had been growing for a week, and near 7 o'clock he came more fully awake than he had been in 2 days, in the way that sometimes happens, the brief clarity that arrives near the end like a last clear day before winter. He looked at the light on the ceiling. He looked at the 4 people in the room with him. "The East Grove," he said to Elena, "row 7. There are 2 trees near the north end that are putting too much into leaf this season. Pruning in February. Cut the upper third." His voice was thin, but the instruction was precise. "Mateo knows which ones." "I'll make a note," Mateo said, and his voice was absolutely steady, which cost him something, though he would not say so. "The roses," Tomás said to Sophia. "The yellow ones on the east bed. Rosa always said they needed lime in the soil in spring. I never remembered to tell you." "I'll remember," Sophia said. He looked at Dieguito, who was sitting very still and very close. "Muchacho," Tomás said. "Abuelo," Dieguito said. "This is your home," Tomás said. "Not because of a document. Because you named the rose." Dieguito pressed his small hand over the old man's hand on the blanket and did not say anything. Because he was 9 years old, and some things are too large for 9-year-old words. And he knew it. Tomás closed his eyes. The light moved across the ceiling in the way it moved in November, slowly, measuring time in the way that light measures time better than any watch. He breathed slowly. He breathed less often. The room was quiet in the way a room is quiet when the people in it are not quiet by accident, but by intention, by the understanding that some moments require silence, the way some soil requires lime, because without it, certain things cannot bloom. He died at 7:14 in the morning, in his own bed, with the orange groves visible through the east window, their fruit heavy and bright in the November light. His last breath was not dramatic. It was simply the last of a series, like the last note of a long song, the one that lets you know the song is complete. The funeral was held on a Friday, 3 days later, in the Santa Lucia church that Tomás had attended for 70 years with varying degrees of conviction and consistent presence. The church was full. Small towns fill their churches for men who kept their word over 8 decades, and Tomás Aguirre had kept his word, and the church was full. Gerardo was there, and Fidel, and Beto, who had become a permanent employee in the 4th year, and who had brought his wife and his mother. Licenciado Guerrero was there. The cooperative manager, Villegas, was there, which surprised Mateo, and did not surprise Elena. The librarian from Santa Lucia, who had told Mateo to keep the agricultural economics book, was there. The woman who bought rose cuttings from Sofia was there, in the third row. Matteo gave the eulogy. He was 17 years old, and he stood at the lectern and spoke for 8 minutes in a voice that did not shake, because he had decided it would not shake. About a man he had known for 6 years, and who had given him a ledger book and said, "2 sets of eyes are better than 1. He spoke about the orange groves and the specific gravity of 847 trees, and what it meant to care for a thing that would outlive you. He did not cry, and no one who knew Matteo expected him to, and everyone who knew Matteo understood that the precision of his words was his grief, as exact as numbers. Sofia left a spray of roses from the garden on the coffin, the yellow hybrid teas, which were blooming unseasonally in the warm November, which she had taken as a sign of something she did not name. Dieguito held Elena's hand through the whole service. In the years after, the rancho did what Tomas had built it to do. It endured. Matteo turned 18 in the first year after and completed his accounting certification and took over the cooperative correspondence and the seasonal labor contracts and the irrigation scheduling in the way he did all things, methodically, with notation. He was not Tomas, but he was something related to Tomas, a young man who had been educated by the same soil and the same rows and the same understanding that a farm is a negotiation with things you cannot control, and you might as well negotiate respectfully. By the time he was 22, the East Grove was producing 320 tons in good years, a yield that Tomas had never achieved. Because Matteo had read a study in his agricultural economics book about a different irrigation timing for the autumn flowering period, and had tried it, and found it worked, and written it down. Sofia, at 21, was supplying rose cuttings to 3 florists in Santa Lucia, and 1 in the regional capital. She had expanded the garden to include a second section outside the original wall, with Elena's agreement and the cooperation of Licenciado Guerrero, who had confirmed that the trust's terms permitted agricultural improvements, planting 30 new varieties from catalogs that she ordered with the same care Rosa had ordered catalogs from, in a different era. The original garden was maintained exactly as Rosa had maintained it, because Sofia understood, in the way she understood all growing things, the difference between what you preserve and what you grow. In the northeast corner, under the south-facing wall, the white roses that had seeded themselves grew every year, unnamed and unbounded, because some things grow where they decide to grow. Dieguito, at 14, had taken over the daily morning walk of the rows from Matteo, who was spending more time at the cooperative office in Santa Lucia that year. He walked them before school, in the early light, with the confidence of a boy who has known the name of every row since he was 4 years old. He still called them by the names he had given them. Row 7 was still El Abuelo. Row 3 was still Caprichoso. Row 12 was still El Mentiroso. And he had taught the names to the new seasonal worker who had joined for that harvest, who had looked at him with the expression of a man encountering something unexpected, and had written the names in his own notebook without being asked. Elena, in those years, ran the house and the trust accounts and the kitchen garden and the 3 children with the same quality she had always had, the quality of a person who does what is needed without needing it noticed. She had taken to sitting in the evenings in the rose garden, not on the copper bench, which she considered Tomas's, but on a low stone wall that Sofia had built at the edge of the west bed as a border, which served equally well as a place to sit. She sat there in the late evenings with a cup of tea and the sound of the groves in whatever wind was moving, and she thought about Hector sometimes, and about Pozo Hondo, and about the wooden trunk that was still in the upstairs room where it had been since the first night, unpacked now and used as a blanket chest, repaired once by Matteo, who had tightened the iron clasps with tools from the porch box. She thought about the gate on that first evening, the creak of it, the way the old man had stood inside and looked at her for a long time before opening it. She thought about what it meant that he had opened it. She had been thinking about that for 7 years, and she thought she was beginning to understand it, not as a kindness, not as a transaction, but as what it had been from the beginning, a recognition. Two nothings, finding that together they added up to something. An empty house and a family with nowhere to go, making the only sensible arithmetic. She drank her tea. Above the east wall, the stars that Tomas had navigated by for 78 years were the same stars, doing what they had always done, marking position, measuring the night, confirming that here is here, and now is now, and the ground beneath you is the ground you have tended, and it will hold you. The roses moved in the wind. The groves held their fruit. The gate at the front of the property, the wrought iron gate that Tomas's father had built, the one that leaned slightly to the left after decades of use, was oiled now and swung cleanly on its hinges and closed with a click that was not a question and not an answer, but simply the sound of a boundary that is maintained because the people inside it have chosen to maintain it, together, because this is their home. And a home is not a building, and it is not a piece of paper, and it is not the creak of a gate or the weight of a wooden trunk, but it is something you know in the exact way that an old dog knows warmth, not in words, not in documents, but in the accumulated certainty of every morning you have woken to find yourself still here, and still needed, and still belonging to the place that belongs to you. So tell me, which moment touched your heart the most? Was it the night Elena drove through the dark to the hospital with no panic and no hesitation, because she had already learned that fear costs time you don't have? Or the morning Sophia came to find Tomas in row 7 and asked simply, "Are you ready now?" And he said, "Not exactly, but maybe close enough." Or perhaps it was Dieguito, 4 years old, pressing his hand over an old man's hand on the blanket and saying nothing at all because he was 9 years old. And some things are too large for words. Tell me in the comments. I read every one of them. And if this story touched your soul, subscribe to Alma en Historias, because there is always a story waiting for you here.